AI is like the story of the year, maybe the decade, which is that these attacks are going to be at just much bigger volume and they're going to be bigger and bigger distractions. People are going to be able to create fake documents very easily, whether they're good or not. They are a distraction and kind of a time suck. And so it's really going to be about creating a holistic, multi-layered approach to fighting fraud going forward.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Good Question Podcast, a podcast at Inscribe where we ask the big questions shaping the future of fraud, AI, and trust. I'm Ronan Burke, CEO and co-founder of Inscribe, and today I'm excited to be joined by Laura Spearman, co-founder and president of Alloy, the leading identity and fraud prevention platforms serving over 600 banks, credit unions, and fintechs. And I'm sure many of you know them already, or perhaps even work with them. So today we're going to do something a little bit different. Both Inscribe and Alloy have recently released our annual fraud reports. Ours focus on document fraud, and Alloy focus more on the broader fraud landscape. So we're going to dig into our findings and what it all means for fraud leaders heading into 2026. So Laura, great to have you on the podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Ronan. I'm excited to be here.
Before we get into the actual reports, it'd be great to just hear a little bit more about Alloy's journey over the past decade and also how your role has evolved over the past 10 years.
Sure. So we're coming up on 11 years of running Alloy. My co-founders and I started the business in 2015 after working together at a previous startup where we found that identity was a really complicated and nuanced, but sort of high leverage challenge in financial services. High leverage and high stakes, both because if you get it wrong, you can be in deep trouble, as we all know. If you get it right, you have high conversion, a delightful customer experience, sort of all the things that banks and fintech companies and credit unions are aspiring to deliver. And so we started looking at the problem and realizing that part of it was just simply access to better identity data. And so we started compiling, in its kind of most basic form, compiling identity databases and making them easy for fintech companies and originally, and then ultimately banks and credit unions to access via API and via kind of a more sophisticated rules engine and platform where they could control how they make decisions, how they change their decision-making abilities, how they change their rules, how they change their access to data over time, and then how they display it, how they talk to regulators, how they show it internally, how they might do analytics on it. And so it evolved from kind of a simple, let's just add in some, an API to a identity database over to now 250 plus databases, many different partners there, different integration points, and lots of different capabilities within the platform to test, audit, control, write rules, et cetera, all in a really easy to use interface. And so now we have 700 plus clients across banks, credit unions, and fintech companies. And my role in particular has changed. I was the chief revenue officer for the first 7 or 8 years of the business, moved into a role as president a couple of years ago. And so largely focus on relationships with our clients, our biggest clients, partners now, and certainly still stay close to the revenue organization. I work with our sales and marketing teams quite closely. So I've had the pleasure of kind of watching the industry evolve alongside running Alloy for 10 years now, 10 plus years now.
Yeah, awesome. And from our perspective at Inscribe as well, we have seen Alloy have this impact at a lot of the customers that we work with. So it's great to be able to collaborate. And yeah, a note of your large customer base that also really helped provide a ton of insights for your fraud report. And so your report surveyed over 600 decision makers across banks and fintechs. And so lots of very interesting data and probably one of the most comprehensive reports of its kind in the industry. So excited to jump into it. And my first question, I guess, is just a high level. Any kind of single thing that stands out to you in particular, or anything that's kind of changed year over year as you've run the report for a couple of years now?
Yeah, so we've asked these kind of questions to fraud and risk leaders for a few years now, and it's been really interesting to watch both the questions and the answers actually, evolve over time and people's priorities. And it sort of gives us hints into both what's happening now, of course, and what we see beyond the scenes. And one of the reasons I'm excited to talk to you is because you guys have a very different lens, but very complimentary lens about what you're seeing from your customers and the actual documents that are changing hands here. I think one of the interesting things we saw this year was kind of around this question of like, at what point are you detecting fraud? We as a company were really focused for the first 7 or 8 years of the business on onboarding fraud, and we still, detect quite a bit of onboarding fraud. But as the industry has moved, and by industry, I guess I mean both the fraud industry, the fraud committing industry, as well as the fraud prevention industry and banks and credit unions, it's moved to post-origination largely. Mm-hmm. And so we've started sort of looking more at what happens after an account gets opened. What signals do we have that let us know, hey, fraud's being committed after we've opened the account, or after you've moved a bunch of money, or now that you're attaching a new bank account or have a new login. And so this year, I think what was surprising was that there was a kind of 9% decline in banks, credit unions, and fintech companies detecting fraud at onboarding. Wow. And then a 7% increase in them detecting the fraud post-transaction. And so I think that kind of signals both a need for better controls from the start, right? Can you actually could you have detected some of that fraud that happened later, but could you have stopped them from even getting in your door? But also figuring out how you figure out those signals post origination, right? What are the signals you're going to look at? What data do you have access to, or could you have access to, that would have led you to a different decision?
Very interesting. And what do you think is driving that 9% decline on onboarding? Is it a recognition and learning on the fraudsters and the fraud industry that it's easier to fraudulently kind of get access to a larger sum of money if you get onboarded to a platform first, and then you kind of do whatever is needed then to get access to a loan or some money and so on? So curious to hear if you have any kind of intuition on that.
Nothing definitive, but I think there are two things at play here. One good, one bad. One good is that I think we are focused, and our clients, or I should say, are the people responding to the survey, are thinking a lot more about post-origination fraud detection. So that's sort of the plus of this. I think the minus is that onboarding fraud can be hard to detect, or lots of fraud can be hard to detect. One of the types of fraud that we all know has been on the rise has been sort of money mules and scams. And so I think part of it is that we are seeing people, or first-party fraud too, right? We have these people onboarding who look good. They may look good because they actually are good and they themselves are getting scammed. They may look good, but ultimately they turn out to be bad actors. And so I think this category of first-party fraud and scams are just blurring the lines in a way that we have never really had to deal with as much as now. And so I think we're struggling to categorize fraud. We're struggling to figure out what it is. I think even fraudsters are, we have this kind of blurry line of intent that is really hard to even talk about, right? If I fudged an address on something, but I didn't really think of it as fraud, it is fraud, but I may not even really think of it as fraud, as opposed to sort of pure play, bad actor, fraud ring that is probably easy for us to all put in the bad actor fraud bucket.
Yeah, the degree to which it's malicious is always an interesting conversation we have at Inscribe as well, and with our customers.
Yeah, right. And documents are probably a key place where that comes up, right? Forging documents may not always feel malicious.
Exactly. Utility bills, for example, are a very frequently modified document. And it's one of the things that we found in our report as well. But a lot of it is, first-party fraud where somebody moved address and they just didn't update their
can't be bothered to
right. Exactly. And so it's but trying to separate out the intent from our customer's perspective is often very difficult. If a document has been tampered with, it can't be trusted. And so it's a very nuanced case.
And we've all had that experience as customers, right? Of it's incredibly frustrating to deal with this thing. You may not be getting any financial gain or have any intention of defrauding anyone, but you might be trying to do something like that. I think it also speaks to one of the other surprises, which is that more leaders this year seem to be thinking of fraud and fraud prevention and your strategy as actually potentially being beneficial for growth of your business. And so delivering kind of on that note, how do you deliver a really good customer experience? You deliver it by treating, sort of the good actors in as good a way as possible and creating very little friction so they don't get really frustrated in trying to prove their identity. They don't have to call the call center 5 times. And on the other hand, of course, not letting in the bad actors. And so I think there's this recognition that fraud prevention is actually sort of a growth tool or a growth enabler when done correctly.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that is a growing trend we're seeing across our customer base as well. It's almost like fraud review or dynamic treatment of customers based on their behaviors. And, for like most customers, like fraud is almost a needle in a haystack type problem
Yes.
where 95% of customers are all good. They should be processed as quick as possible. And then for like maybe 1% or 2%, they're like edge cases, they need to be reviewed. And then there's like 3 or so percent then, which are like known fraudsters, high conviction, malicious behavior, and can be rejected outright.
Yep.
Yeah, one thing you also mentioned there in terms of what might be driving like a 9% decline in onboarding fraud is just the difficulty is to detect this fraud. But one thing that we've noticed is just the tooling to commit fraud is improving at a rate that we haven't seen before, and especially as it relates to AI. And so, in your report, I think 91% of your respondents said they noticed more financial crimes being committed with AI technology, which is an absolutely incredible stat. And it basically, what I take from that is that there's a huge amount of awareness among banks and fintechs right now of AI assisting in fraud attacks. And, we've even seen it on our side too. Within document fraud, we've seen a 5x increase in AI generated fraud from April to December of last year. So I guess my question on this is just, what are your thoughts or, I guess, prediction on how AI will impact the rate of fraud? Like if we were to do this report again next year, will we see this come true in the data then?
Yeah, I think undoubtedly we will. I'm super interested in this sort of tension between AI as a driver of just more volume versus AI as a driver of level of sophistication in fraud attacks. And I think right now, I think we see both, right? There are both more sophisticated fraud attacks and higher volume. But I think a lot of what we're actually seeing in the data and what I suspect we'll see for a while is just higher volume of fraud attempts based on having incredible abilities with AI agents who can generate all sorts of fake data, just a variety of attacks. And they aren't necessarily all that sophisticated, but it just means a higher kind of caseload that you are now dealing with as a financial institution. And so I think that's where it becomes easy for these financial institutions to say, shut the gates, put up as many barriers as possible. And it's where, because of that, it just becomes crucial to figure out how to effectively triage and make sure that you allow, again, your fraud prevention strategy to become growth enabling, not just preventing downside and protection oriented here. But I think, I think we're dealing with unprecedented levels of and just volumes of these attacks.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point, and we've seen it in our own data as well. Fraudsters are using LLMs now to create fake documents, but a lot of them that are created from scratch are actually not very good or not very convincing. An untrained eye would easily spot this is not what a Bank of America bank statement should look like. However, though, companies that are using like fully automated decisioning systems without like good fraud prevention placed on top, like some of them might be vulnerable to it. And similar to how like elderly abuse scams work, where some of these like call scams are actually intentionally bad just so you can find the weak links in the market and in the landscape. And so there's an interesting dynamic there. But where we are actually seeing AI really helping fraudsters actually modifying existing documents. So like download a template and then just use the LLM to modify a small
change
piece
some
of
details.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think we're seeing there's a lot of FIs who only rely on document verification, which is our push to the industry is like, do not have it be single threaded on document. You need multiple controls there. You need biometrics, you need an IP address, you need all sorts of things. And so I think that is where having a kind of a single source of truth, whether it's hopefully it's continues to be bad documents that can easily be caught, but we need to have other sources of data to effectively control fraud and identify it.
Yeah, exactly. The full picture often emerges quite quickly if you've good coverage across the various different data points. Another thing your report mentioned was synthetic identity creation being like one of the top things that your customers are concerned about. But I'm very curious to understand what that means for your customers in terms like synthetic identity could be, somebody creating kind of a name address combo and asking for 100 of them to
Yes.
be produced and it submit 100 applications, or it could be using a vibe coding tool to create a fake website and then create fake transactions and then put them onto a bank statement and then apply for like 15 different loans. But yeah, curious to see
Yeah.
how you think your customers are seeing this appear in their
Yeah.
data.
I think in general, the classifications require a lot of caveats because what we've talked about is these A, fraud can be hard to categorize and is increasingly hard to categorize. B, there are blurred lines now between categories, sort of genuinely confusing, different types of fraud that I don't think fit as neatly into the buckets that we designed, a decade ago when we started talking about digital fraud in financial institutions. I think in some cases, what appears to be first party fraud is actually synthetic fraud. And a lot of that is also hybrid. So, like you're saying, so some details may be real, some details may be fake. Again, the AI makes this faster, easier to do at scale. And so I think that's one of the reasons that we're seeing the increase in synthetic identity fraud, whether that's truly synthetic or hybrid or blurs into first party, I think is a little bit subjective here. But I think that's a big part of what we're seeing is that it's just easy to create that data. And so that is one of the reasons I think we're seeing the huge interest from these leaders and interest in synthetic.
Yeah, for sure. Our customers are also like saying the same in terms of the ease at which these tools are enabling synthetic data to be created is just like totally unprecedented. And
Yes.
just one final learning that we've had in our research is even if it's not being used to create like the actual synthetic identities and all the believable supporting information, LLMs can also just assist fraudsters in terms of knowing what to change or what data to provide to make it convincing. So almost using it as an assistant in terms of helping them guide them like step by step through everything they need to consider to have a fully believable, convincing application to open up a bank account. And then when you have a bank account opened, how long you need to kind of churn through some transactions and activity
Have
on it to
some
make it
real
look
activity
believable.
that looks good. Yeah, isn't that
Yeah,
crazy?
yeah, it's wild. And so I think there's an overarching theme here of just like the industrialization of fraudsters, and
Yes.
fraud is becoming an industry for a lot of organized criminals right now. And historically, it used to be just like sharing of information on social media forums and online, but now they're actually like using tooling to scale it up, like we were talking about earlier.
I think that's exactly right. It's, the rules don't apply to them, the rules apply to us. They are very well funded at this point. It's an entire industry, like you're saying. And I think it's also often, this is a little bit more anecdotal, but I think we see a lot of leaders at financial institutions telling us that they're incredibly worried about first party fraud. And I don't mean to downplay that first party fraud is not happening or not real. It certainly is. But I think some of it is actually that the sophistication level of these fraud rings is so high now that you really detect, you think this is the real person. You think it's Laura and I was a good actor and there's no way I could have figured this out because it's so convincing. And I think that's really what's changed from 5 years ago, is that
Yeah.
it is just so much more convincing in many ways. And if you have the tools like the ones you just described, I think things look a lot more like first party fraud, even when they're not.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess in terms of the response we as an industry and our customers can have, one interesting stat I saw in your report is that 82% of organizations are increasing investment in AI driven fraud prevention, which again, I think is a huge number. It's incredible to see, but very curious to hear about what that actually looks like in terms of deployments. Is it still like experimentation phase right now, or are you seeing some use cases of AI being adopted to really help? And there's like so many areas of a business that could help, but very curious to hear if you've seen any great examples in like fraud prevention specifically.
I think the big thing is that people have been using like AI driven or machine learning driven models, for example, in fraud detection for many, many years. And so I think there's kind of two big things here. One is that you might be using those, and I've seen our clients do this where they might have the best, most sophisticated models on the market, but if they aren't able to do two key things, it doesn't mean a whole lot. So they need to be able to put that all together in one picture. And so you can imagine sort of a case where you have a bunch of different scores, let's say. I mean, just boiling these down, they're, in the end of the day, they tend to be just scores of people or transactions. If you don't have a complete picture, sort of holistic picture, it doesn't help you all that much to say, well, provider A said this number and provider B said this number and provider C. You really have to have a platform and orchestration, analytics, like all the stuff to be able to understand and test these things over time. You can't just kind of keep buying the best silver bullet AI model that's on the market this month and then another one the next month. You have to sort of layer them appropriately. The second thing you have to be able to do is have an actionable response. So you've detected the fraud and maybe you've gotten really, really good at that with your set of tools, but you have to figure out what's next. And again, this is all in service of like, you can't just shut down your business. You can't just shut your front door. And we used to see our clients doing that. Like, I'm hitting a fraud attack. Great. I detected it. I feel really good about myself. Now I'm shutting down, right? I'm going to stop my online channel. Like you can't do that. Or you can, but it's not a great response to have if you want to run a business. And so I think that's where we see this kind of like what we think about internally as actionable AI. Like, how do you have a response right away that you can deploy within seconds that still lets people through the door, the right people through the door, and provides the right friction to the people you're not sure about. And so that's where we think the industry is headed and needs to head and we think about it a little bit like having an alarm system in your home that rings an alarm but doesn't call the police, right? You have to have a way of dealing with what's happening. And so one of the things we've developed, for example, is just a set of responses that our clients have where under certain conditions, we immediately set off, XYZ things. So we're going to now put people up through step-up document verification when they didn't have it or when it wouldn't have been triggered originally. And that may be a temporary measure. Hopefully it's a temporary measure, but it's crucial during those moments where you're being attacked to have a kind of plan B that is not to just shut down your business.
Yeah, very, very interesting insights. And one of the things I think is just a great point that you mentioned at the top of your answer there is the distinction between like different forms of AI. Like traditional machine learning models have been used in like decisioning in financial services for probably like a couple of decades at this point. And then most recently, we've moved into the world of large language models, which I think to your broader point that you made are actually quite difficult to make automated decisions based on the outputs of LLMs. They're inherently like non-deterministic. It's hard to get them to like work well in needle and haystack type problems. For example, if fraud occurs at an incident rate of like 3 or 4%, but your LLM also goes off piste in 3 to 4% of the cases too, that means like you've a pretty noisy system with tons of false positives. Yeah. And so I think in that world, and we're always like collaborating with customers in terms of asking what role do LLMs have in the next wave of AI adoption at banks and fintechs. And especially for the automated decisioning, it's a really like tricky form factor to try determine. But one thing that we've been seeing or almost like gaining inspiration from is how customer support teams are using LLMs to provide answers to customers, or how code generation companies like Cursor are using the IDE as like the human in the loop, or legal review companies like Harvey using like the Word document redlining process to have humans in the loop. But for fraud teams, I don't think as an industry fraud vendors have figured out what that form factor looks like. And I think it is this friction or tension between we need to automate everything. Well, not everything, but as much as possible.
Yeah.
And so it's hard to have the LLMs play in the full automation world yet. But I think, there's a lot of great research going on in terms of the foundation model providers. So it might get to a point this year where, agentic systems that do planning and call in tools as needed might get to a point where precision recall is good enough. So it's something that we're kind of eagerly researching, but also excited to hear and see what other folks are doing. But I'd love to hear your perspective on that if you've done anything in that.
Yeah, I think we think a lot about agentic in particular as being, so we talked about the kind of AI ML driven models. I think that has been incredibly helpful in fraud prevention over the last few years, but I don't think it's necessarily sort of step change new. I think what is interesting is more the agentic side of things. Again, there's some bad to it, right? I think the agents are able to create synthetic identities very easily. But on the fraud prevention side, I think it's actually really interesting because ultimately a lot of this prevention work comes down to reviewing things, right? A human who has to review stuff. And that stuff, in this particular case, may be fraud triggers, but a lot of it actually may be compliance oriented too in the world of financial services. And so when you can take away some of what the bulk of the work is, which is largely low risk, false positives, I think about this as being pretty acute in business applications, which I'm sure you see as well, right? Where there is a lot of stuff to review in a business application in kind of a KYB scenario. If you can have AI agents that do a lot of that work, that take a lot of the low risk, a lot of the false positives, reviewing sanctions hits that almost always are kind of just reviewing tons of lines on a page to ultimately discover that the first name is totally different anyways. I think that's a really good kind of use case for some of the AI agents and that we're really excited about. And so I think that will help alleviate the workload and allow us as an industry, but really like fraud analysts, to focus on the high risk stuff where you really still want to be super, super sure about what you're looking at. And the AI tools can help with that, but not fully replace that yet.
Yeah, it's a great framing. Like let's say 95% of the cases are fully automated and don't require any human review. That means the 5% that are remaining basically take up most of the time of a human review team. And so that isn't to say that it's not an important cohort. It might sound small in the overall application numbers, but it's actually 100% of an operations team time. And there's still a ton of impact to be had there. And yeah, like I think compliance is a great use case. And another one we've heard a lot about is just like developing UBO maps of organizations. Yeah. It's very difficult for humans to do it, but machines and LLMs can do it just as well, or at least do
probably
it without,
better in certain cases.
Yeah, exactly. And it's such a task. It's a task that like operations teams hate performing. It's very tedious and complicated. Yeah. But yeah, it's certainly one area to watch. So I'd like to just touch on credit unions a little bit more. So in your report, it showed up as like credit unions are experiencing the largest increase in fraud events. I think it was like 72% increase from last year. That's very interesting for us to hear. Over the past 2 years, we've been doing more work with credit unions like BCU, Logix, and Connect to FCU. And so we've been seeing this as well. But I'm very curious to hear if you think credit unions are being targeted more now than, let's say, fintechs or the large enterprise banks.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And of course, we don't really know definitively why this is the way it is. And I hope we get more insight over the next year. But with community banks and regional banks and credit unions all reporting higher fraud rates at ATMs, contact centers, branches compared to enterprise banks and fintech companies, it obviously begs the question, have enterprise institutions really invested all that much more in fraud prevention at these places? Or are these smaller institutions just kind of better at categorizing it and defining it, catching it, I suppose? And I think one possible explanation, of course, is that these credit unions and mid-market institutions just have not invested as heavily in fraud prevention in these channels relative to enterprise banks. They often have smaller budgets, smaller teams, et cetera. But I think one hypothesis we have is that a lot of these credit unions and community banks have been more focused on digital channels, and that's where they get defrauded the most, and therefore that is where they've put their fraud prevention efforts. So that's our current hypothesis, and the 71% of respondents said that fraud most commonly occurs in their online or mobile banking channels, and so that's naturally where you'd put your resources. I think the cautionary tale for us as an industry is that as omni-channel experiences become really important to consumers, and as these institutions invest in omni-channel, so you can walk into a bank branch and complete the application you started online in person, great experience, we have to be able to have omni-channel fraud prevention. And so I think that's, in general, fraud goes where there is still a gap. So fraudsters will now go to bank branches if that's where they need to go, if your defenses are good on digital. And so we have to invest in omni-channel strategies, I think.
Yeah, and just in the same type of behavior in terms of fraudsters going for the gaps, like another phenomenon that we've been keeping an eye on is fraudsters actually adapting based on like how easy it is to get through a particular institution's system. And so like fraudsters care about efficiency as well, and they will not keep targeting businesses that keep
they're running businesses too.
Yeah. And so one effect that we're also aware of as well is as more and more credit unions adopt advanced fraud prevention. The ones that haven't yet provided it will actually start getting smaller and smaller, but they may experience a disproportionate amount of fraud because the fraudsters will realize that they are the ones who have yet to adopt the latest fraud prevention techniques. I hope this doesn't happen. And I think one way in which we can help the industry ensure that this doesn't happen is for vendors like us to actually aim to distribute our product to like each segment of the market geographically, but also in terms of like credit union size and strategy, or at least follow them throughout their journey. And I think the digital transformation journey is one great example of that, where the fintechs were digitally native, and then a lot of the bigger banks invested quite early, and then I think the credit unions and regionals now have been doing a great job. And so like our go-to-market efforts have actually mirrored that as well, and that we got started with the fintechs, and then we're kind of following the wave as it trickles down into the credit unions.
What I love about that is I think, and we've had the same experience over the years, is I think it's a little bit like the leapfrogging infrastructure thing is like now we have credit unions and regional banks, community banks who have access to sort of the best without having had decades of, or maybe a decade of kind of homegrown solutions or layers of what are currently subpar solutions to unwind, both contractually, but more importantly, from an integration and technology perspective. And so I actually really am bullish on credit unions and community banks being able to more easily adapt in many ways than institutions with much more sophisticated tech teams or much bigger budgets, frankly.
Yeah, exactly. And that's something we're like particularly excited by as well. It's just like getting our solution is improving at like such a rate now that even if you like buy our same like product offering in terms of the individual features this year compared to last year, it's like the rate of advancement, and obviously it's a lot of it's powered by network effects, but it actually becomes easier for credit unions to purchase our product because the performance is increasing so much. And for some buyers, like it's easier for them to make a investment like this if it's like a home run, and easy ROI conversation.
The kind of marginal part doesn't help as much as just like, let's, catch 5 times as much fraud as you were catching. It's an incredible pitch.
Yeah, exactly. Another characteristic and observation we've had at credit unions is they're, tend to be like member owned. And so it's a different type of structure compared to a traditional kind of shareholder owned, and in terms of private shareholder owned, like regional bank or large public bank. But we had a comment recently on a webinar where someone in the chat said that maybe they're being naive, but they didn't feel like their customers or members would do something like this. And by do something, they were referring to like committing document fraud. But very curious to hear if you've seen any of this type of dynamic in place with your customers in terms of believing that their members are higher trust than other members as part of other credit unions.
It's such I love that comment. I mean, aside from my perspective on whether that's real or not, I just love the sort of sentiment there, because I think that's a theme I've seen with credit union leaders is they really feel a responsibility. They feel a real relationship with their customers that I think I can understand on the other side how you would feel sort of more taken aback when you're being kind of attacked with fraud. I actually don't think the sentiment is all that wrong, not necessarily because it's member owned, but because of what we previously discussed, which I think that there's sort of an over categorization sometimes, or misclassification at a minimum, of first party fraud. And that I'm not sure that circumstances where it looks like your own, good actor turned bad member, I actually think sometimes this was a bad actor to begin with, or sort of a money mule scam, account takeover type of situation that just isn't caught or isn't identified as such. And so I actually think there is sort of a possibility that credit union is right, that their members didn't actually intentionally defraud them, that it might be something else. And again, I think that's just due to kind of misclassification or misunderstanding, these blurred lines that are becoming increasingly relevant.
Yeah, exactly. I think that it's something we see all the time in terms of the blurred lines, not only between first and third party, but also between fraud and credit.
Yes.
That, what looks like a credit issue is actually an undetected fraud issue up front. And we've seen this in our data. Like in our report, we found that 40% of altered documents only have the financial information modified. And so, it's your like one that kind of basically shows that they are actually themselves, they're applying, and like they might even have a good relationship with a particular representative they're working with at the bank. And then
And they may
that
have
good
full intention of repaying their loan, right? They may just, they
yeah,
may have
they might even
sort of
repay
as,
for the first couple of months.
yeah,
Yeah. And
yeah,
and so it is almost like even like difficult for our customers then to admit that it was upfront fraud instead of it being,
yeah.
hey, their employment circumstances changed 6 months down the line. And so it's a very tricky thing when it comes to attribution. And then there's also like the impact then in terms of investing in the right areas of a funnel to make sure that
Yeah.
such issues are being caught.
Right. And it's right. It's why your funnel has to be complete, right? And kind of transparent, collect all the signals you can. You can't just detect it onboarding or just do onboarding and then later on have a couple of moments where you're able to detect it, once they've defrauded you. You really have to be looking at all the different, the logins, the IP addresses, the usual behavior, which is another reason why I think AI models are useful, right? Is you can now actually look at many more pieces of data that are sort of unique to your customer or your customer base and say, yes, this behavior looks usual for them, or no, it doesn't look usual for them. You can't be applying blanket statements and blanket rules across what people are doing because behavior should change across people and business types and all sorts of stuff. And so I think it's what has just made this sort of our categorization and our way of thinking from 5 years ago, it's made it almost obsolete.
Yeah, agreed. Well, cool. We're coming up in time here, but I just have three final questions to close us out for today. So, first question, if you had to bet on one fraud trend that will define 2026, what would that be?
So I think agentic AI is where it's at. So again, AI agents will create more, convincing phishing scams at scale. That will be a problem. On the other hand, I think we will have agents we can deploy to do a lot of what we discussed, a lot of the kind of potentially lower risk, high volume, especially compliance investigations, for example, things like watch lists and PEP hits and things like that, where you can spend a lot of time reviewing things today, ultimately to come up with the same answer over and over, which is this is a low risk and this was a false positive, basically, which is so much of that work. So I think agentic solutions will be huge and fairly easily adoptable. And I think they're not getting as much attention just because they're sort of, we think of them internally sometimes as even just glorified Googling, but glorified Googling is what people spend a lot of time on in our industry. And so if you can save them their glorified Googling time, I think that's really significant and lets people focus on higher priority, high dollar volume, high risk fraud cases.
Yeah, when we do customer research, we often ask what kind of tools you're using, and we kind of get like the first list first, and then we say, okay, what about Excel and Google? But the reality is, like, a lot of folks don't even consider them tools because they're so core to workflows. But
yes,
the reality is that people actually live in these tools and are just so foundational that they're not even considered tools.
I probably shouldn't even call it glorified Googling. It's just Googling.
Yeah, exactly. Curious as well, if you had one question you wish more fraud leaders would ask themselves, what would that be?
Yeah, this one is kind of easy for me. I think they will ask it, but it's really today they ask how much and fraud teams might on how much fraud they've stopped, and that's an important number. But I think one of the other key numbers that they need to report on is how much sort of good customer business have they declined or created friction for, or unknowingly potentially shut down that account. So I think being able to understand the downside of your barriers that you've created, your defense mechanism, what is the sort of good business downside or good business declines that you've created, and be able to measure that and report on that. Because I think it's incredibly important to know what that dollar volume may be actually quite high. It's one of the reasons we often advise our clients you don't want to get to zero frauds. You don't want to have no fraud at all happening, because it just means you're not letting anything good through. And so I think it's really where you need to spend time is like, what am I preventing when I'm also preventing fraud?
Yeah, great insight. And finally, if someone read both of our reports back to back, is there one takeaway you'd hope that they would take?
I think AI is like the story of the year, maybe the decade, which is that these attacks are going to be at just much bigger volume, and they're going to be bigger and bigger distractions. People are going to be able to create fake documents like we talked about very easily, whether they're good or not. They are a distraction and kind of a time suck. And so it's really going to be about creating a holistic, multi-layered approach to fighting fraud going forward. You're going to have to look at the full life cycle. And that's sort of on multiple dimensions, full life cycle across time. You're also going to have to look at all different types of signals, not just documents, not just transactions. And so how do you create this very holistic stack, as it were? That's going to be the biggest thing that fraud leaders can do for the future when we're in this kind of unprecedented AI-driven fraud landscape.
Yep, I love it. Great insight in terms of what we need to do next year. And I think the message to our customers is often keep on adapting, keep on learning, and we as vendors are going to help them throughout that journey. So yeah, Laura, thanks very much for the time today. It's been great hearing your insights from your fraud report and just more generally from your experience in the industry for the past decade. And to our listeners, thanks for joining. We hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to learn more about each of our reports, you can find them on our respective websites. And yeah, if you've enjoyed the podcast, feel free to subscribe. And as always, keep asking good questions. Yep. Thanks
so much for having me. And I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks, Laura.